Hello, Chris. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you?
Great. Chris, we're honored to have you in our podcast. We understand your busy schedule, and it's a privilege to sit down with you and hear from your insight on your work and your journey. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Hello, viewers. Welcome to Talk to Phoebe podcast, where we explore leadership, innovation, business transformation, and the people shaping the future of growth. I'm your host, Phoebe. Today, I'm joined by Chris Maresca. Chris is an operating partner, technology advisor to private equity firms, managing partner to C32, board member, and one of the leading experts in technology due diligence, AI strategy, value creation, and exit strategy. Over the past 20 years, Chris has participated in 9 successful exits totaling more than $0.5 billion in value and has over 50 technology transformation across SaaS, AI, healthcare, logistics, data analytics companies. Chris specializes in helping investors and CEOs separate technology reality from technology storytelling. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so let's dive in. Chris, you've built an incredible career at the intersection of technology, private equity, and business transformation. How did this journey begin?
So most of my career has revolved around technology. I actually started my first company in high school, which was a company that designed sound systems for music studios and for nightclubs. And it was built around a piece of software that I wrote that did acoustic modeling. And so I've been a technologist, I guess, for a very long time. And of course, as technology has sort of taken over the world, it was natural for me to move into that over time. And I actually moved to Silicon Valley in 1998 and worked for a company that invented the banner ad. I was project manager for that. Actually, I was the project manager for the first Starbucks website, among other things, the first Home Depot website, the first HP consumer website, and a bunch of other ones. And, it's been a natural progression as in Silicon Valley, there's a saying that software is eating the world, and that's kind of ever more so. And so I've been at the center of this sort of multiple revolutions that are swirling around software and have been lucky enough to be able to take advantage of that. And it's been a journey. I mean, I went through the .com revolution and then the mobile revolution and all of the sort of big data and machine learning a few years ago, and now we're into sort of the AI revolution. And just when you think there's what could we possibly do next, then some new thing comes along. And I've been pretty lucky. I've done a lot of startups, and I've had a lot of exits in startups. I ran a turnaround company. I was a VC for a while, and now I'm in private equity, sort of moving up the food chain, if you will. But it's been pretty interesting. I think, the reality is that somebody said to me, I'm like, well, I work on software businesses, and then the real question is, what's not a software business these days? A number of years ago, my wife and I bought a ranch up in the Sierra foothills near Sacramento, sort of east of Sacramento. And this is a very agricultural area, but of course, agriculture revolves around technology these days as well. I mean, you can't get away from it no matter what you're doing. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's really fascinating. And I still have one foot in San Francisco, where we lived for 30 years. So it's been interesting sort of existing in the real world on the one hand, and existing in this sort of crazy bubble of Silicon Valley on the other hand.
Awesome. So what initially attracted you to technology and operational transformation?
Well, I've always been kind of a nerd. So for me, technology is a kind of a natural fit. One of the things that's miraculous about software is you can learn it on your own. You don't necessarily need to go to school for this, and certainly when I did my first company, I learned, back then it was a lot of books and things like that, but I learned from on my own. And that's very attractive, like being able to do it yourself and then deliver something of value. I think the other thing too that's interesting about software in particular is that the time from an idea to product is quite short.
Yeah.
When you look at other disciplines, if you're talking about like hardware engineering or something, the time from idea to product could be a very long time and require a lot of money. But in software, the time, and it's getting ever shorter, like it's collapsing.
Yeah.
But also the cost of developing software is very low. I mean, at least if you're doing it yourself, like if, as an individual, you need a computer and you need to be obstinate and not easily discouraged, and usually you can make it work. And so that's all very attractive because, that really allows you a certain freedom that you wouldn't get in other industries.
Awesome. That's
Yeah.
very good. So looking back over your career, what lessons stand out from your first major exit?
Well, my first major exit was this company I worked at that when I first moved out to Silicon Valley, it was a company called Organic. Organic's claim to fame is they invented the banner ad. The banner ad that you see on top of all websites, they invented that. And when I worked there, they owned 60% of the advertising inventory on the internet, which is why they had big clients like Starbucks and Home Depot and Mercedes and HP and AutoZone and a ton of other very large companies. And they IPO'd. I was employee 180-ish.
Wow.
By the time I left 18 months later, there were 4,000 employees. I mean, talk about scaling, right? It was ridiculous. It was chaotic. It was, beyond chaos. It was insanity was what it was. It was one of the craziest places I've ever worked, not just because of the growth, but just because it was at a time when San Francisco in particular was a place that was a refuge for all the creative people that didn't fit in other parts of society. And all these people, when the internet came along, they all started internet companies. And so you got this crazy combination of sort of the creative artist culture and technology all in this giant mixing pot. The guy who started Organic was a DJ, and this is stuff that would never happen nowadays. So it was a little crazy back then. And the company IPO'd shortly after I left. And IPO, I don't remember what it was worth, but it was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And that was, the first insight into, wow, you could turn literally nothing into this giant pot of gold effectively.
Yeah.
And it was pretty insane. And after that, I had a number of exits that none of them were nearly as large as that for me personally.
Yeah.
But they did result, the biggest exit that I ever worked on was Nokia, was a division of Nokia that built firewalls.
Wow.
That was based in Mountain View, California, which is in Silicon Valley. And we helped them re-platform their firewalls. And after we did that, they were able to exit the division to Check Point for $1 billion. So that's a pretty big one. But I think, there is a certain rush in this sort of madness of Silicon Valley. That said, it's changed a lot in the last 10 years. The money has not been good for Silicon Valley, the cultural side of it. It's been pretty terrible and corrosive. And now, instead of people chasing an idea to change the world, people are chasing money. And that's a very corrosive kind of environment. And I think, and we've lost something in the process of that. Like the fact that a DJ can't build a $300 million company is something a loss, I think. And I think you see this. People intuitively understand this, which is why there's such a backlash against AI and all those things. It's very dehumanizing, and that's not good. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's kind of interesting what we're going through right now.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
So how has the role of technology changed in determining companies' value?
Well, the whole notion of valuation is abstract for a lot of business owners, right? The idea that somehow or another, because you're implementing a ton of technology, your company goes from being worth, 2x revenue to being worth 20x revenue seems like some kind of a magic trick that people don't really understand. I think, the thing about technology is it's a tool like every other tool, and you can use it, you can misuse it, you can abuse it, you can do a lot of different things with it. And I always tell people, especially I mentor a lot of startups, and I always tell, especially engineers, that engineering is the easy part. The hard part is people. Dealing with people, so sales and marketing are infinitely harder than the engineering side of things. How has technology transformed things? Well, technology has transformed everything. I mean, just look at around what we walk, what's in our pockets. You know, these phones, they're incredible. I mean, they're incredible devices. If 20 years ago somebody told you you'd have all this power in your pocket, people
Yeah.
would have thought you were crazy.
It's
I mean,
true.
it's straight out of science fiction, you know? And you look at the cost of technology. I mean, I was mentioning this to somebody the other day. A 55-inch television 10 years ago, an LCD would have been $10,000. And now
Mhm.
you can go to Walmart and buy one for $150,
It's true.
you know, and that's amazing. And that's true in a lot of areas. And people don't really, especially older generations, don't understand how cheap the technology has become. And it's not just the technology. The technology is also what enables fast fashion, which gives
Mhm.
us all these cheap clothes. Now, whether you agree sort of on a moral, ethical basis on about fast fashion is a different story. But it's
Yeah.
certainly true that that's enabled that by technology and
Yeah.
by all the technology that's driving that. I
Yeah.
saw a thing the other day, which is the new thing in that area, which is AI fashion. So now fast fashion coupled with AI designs, you know, and that's just accelerating that cycle again, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think it's fascinating how it's impacted society. I mean, clearly it's had some really negative impacts. I mean, social media, I don't know about you, but like doom scrolling is a terrible thing. It's easy to get sucked into that.
It's
And
true.
I'm no different than anybody else. I get sucked into that as well. And then you look up and you've just wasted 3 hours doing
True.
absolutely nothing.
It's true.
So yeah, yeah. So
Okay. Awesome. Chris, you've built a reputation for uncovering what you call the gaps between the management story and the technology reality. You've
mhm.
said that private equity firms bring you in when the technology story doesn't hold up under pressure. What does that mean?
Well, you know, like you were just saying, every company is looking for a technology valuation. And the question is that true? Like, you know, really good technology enables scale and growth in a way that you don't get unless you have really good technology. But
Yeah.
the question is, you know, you can tell a good story about that as an executive.
Mhm.
But then if you look at the systems underneath that, are they able to deliver on that story? Are they able to deliver on that story in a way that will change the value of the company? So you may get a situation. I did a due diligence last year on a company that where the CEO thought the company had their own data centers, which, you know, in itself is not necessarily terrible, although that's kind of a giant overhead that you're taking on that maybe you shouldn't be taking on.
Mhm.
But one of the things that struck me was the CEO said that he thought that they could do it better than Amazon or Microsoft or Google. I'm sorry, but that's not possible
Mm.
because you don't have the scale, the experience, the sort of breadth of things that you're working on, or even the people to be able to do that,
Yeah.
right? I mean, Google has something like 6,000 engineers just working on security.
Mm.
Now, you're telling me a company of 400 people is able to match what Google does? No, it's just not possible.
Mm.
And I think there is, to a certain extent, in executive suites, a delusion that they can do it better somehow or another than large companies, and I that are specialists in their field. Like
Mm.
AWS and Amazon are absolutely global leaders in cloud computing and data center development and everything else in that silo, and nobody is touching them. I mean, that's why all these companies are using them as core infrastructure. I
Yeah.
mean, the best example of that is Netflix. So Netflix, one of Netflix's direct competitors is Amazon's Prime Video.
Yeah.
And yet Netflix runs the entirety of its infrastructure on Amazon's infrastructure
Yeah.
because Amazon is the best place to do that.
Yeah.
And I think you know when you look at when people tell stories about their technology, there is sort of the myth versus the reality, and
Yes.
there is often a gap between the two. Now, sometimes the gap is no big deal. It's just, you know, you're just telling a story and it makes a good story, and the gap is not so large. But sometimes there's an illusion here which isn't really true. But
Mm.
I was working with an old client of mine back when I was CTO of a
Mhm.
health tech company, and they have a problem like They're not deploying new technology.
Yeah.
And the reason why they have this problem is because their data is all dispersed. It's all in these different bits and parts of the organization, controlled by different people, different formats, whatever. And my reaction was, you need to centralize all that stuff.
Yeah.
And unless you centralize all that stuff, the story that you're telling about being able to deliver faster, cheaper, better isn't going to happen. Like, you can't deliver on that promise unless you do this. And at the same time, that company was unwilling to make the investment to centralize the data. So this is a disconnected story. Like, you look at this and you're like, how can you deliver on your promise if you won't make the investment to make the data able to deliver on your promise? And you see this a lot, right? And so I think, and that's where I come in, is I'm looking for those areas where there's a gap and where people's story doesn't line up with the way the tech is built.
How often do management presentation over state platform capabilities? I think you've just answered that, but maybe.
Always. The answer is always. Always. And to be fair to management, to executives, is that most executives, their jobs are not about tech, right? And so they are stating what they have been told, and it's difficult because, if you're an executive in a company of any size, you spend most of your time dealing with people and people problems. And whether it's people problems related to customers or vendors or employees, whatever, or contractors or whatever it is, you spend a huge amount of time. People are a time sink. And at the same time, people are the ones that are delivering the value. So, you need to manage all of that. And so, if 90% of your day is dealing with that, you got 10% to focus on everything else, which is finance and, talking to your investors and figuring out what the tech is and building a forward-looking strategy. You don't have a lot of time to really understand what's going on. And so, and the CTO and the people in the technology teams want to believe that what they're building is going to deliver what's necessary. And so it's not like people are lying. It's more like, in some ways, they have to be self-delusional to sort of get their jobs done, even though if you really drill down, they know full well that this stuff isn't working the way it should. But, who's going to admit that? A number of years ago, I was called in by a very, very well-known company that manages outbound communications for a lot of large businesses. And I was called by the CEO, and he said, "Chris, we've had our third CTO in 3 years, and we really need your help, and you need to come in and take over as CTO." I'm like, "Okay, what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, it never seems to work out. The CTOs are all terrible." So I went around and I talked to a bunch of people there, and I wound up talking to the current CTO, who had been employee number 3 at this company. So he knew where all the bodies were buried. And what I realized when I was talking to him is, CTOs are engineers by and large, and they don't know anything about corporate politics, nor do they care, mostly, because they're engineers, which is a really bad thing, because most CTOs have to do board presentations. And the board presentation, so, you get a board presentation, and the VP of sales or the chief revenue officer stands up and said, "Oh, we increased sales by 20% this month, and we made an additional $5 million or whatever it is." Chief of marketing says, "Yeah, we generated, 15% more leads, blah, 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 down the line." And then the CTO stands up, and the first thing he says very proudly is, "We solved, 300 bugs this month." Which is what you just said, is there were 300 problems in our software that we were forced to fix. And that was a sunk costs and didn't generate anything positive. And this was the whole problem here, was not so much that the CTO was doing a bad job, but when they went to present to the board, they were presenting an engineering viewpoint, which is all about all the problems that they fixed, all the problems that they had in the current software, and all this. It was all problems. There was nothing positive about it. And I said to the current CTO, I said, "Look, next time you go into a board meeting, just talk about all the positive stuff you've done. Don't mention any of the problems." 3 years later, he was still CTO. So that obviously worked. So, and this is the thing, right? And so, was he telling the board the whole picture? No. But if he had told the board the whole picture, he would have been fired, right? And so and that's a disconnect between people not in tech and people in tech. And
Yeah.
it's not something, a gap you can close easily
Mhm.
because, fixing bugs is part of the job of engineering, but
Yeah.
nobody wants to hear it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Awesome. I think I'm going to ask you, I think you've also explained my next question. Can you share a story where technology due diligence changed the outcome of a deal?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which end of the spectrum you're looking at. When you're looking at venture, for example,
Mhm.
so venture capital as opposed to private equity, technology due diligence is critical because you need to make sure that the thing you're investing in is actually technology which is going to move the needle and deliver the 10x return that people are looking for. So that's one end of things. Private equity is a little different because typically private equity is buying a business which has a positive cash flow or which is revenue positive, has pretty decent margins, all the metrics. Clearly their stuff works at some
Yeah.
level, or otherwise people wouldn't be paying for it.
Yeah.
The place where technology due diligence matters in private equity is what we describe as remediation costs. So every company has problems with their infrastructure. We had one company I did some due diligence on had a piece of software that they were using under an umbrella license from one of their technology providers.
Mhm.
And the question was, if they don't have that technology provider anymore, how much is that license going to cost, right? Because that represents a remediation cost potentially in the future.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really tell because it sort of depended on how they were deploying this technology.
Yeah.
But the remediation cost could be upwards of $20 million. Now, on a $100 million deal, that might kill the deal.
Yeah.
On a $500 million deal, that's just a line item cost you're going to have to figure out how to deal with in the future.
Yeah.
So it depends sort of on the size of the deal. And there's all kinds of stuff like that that's buried in people's, in their closets, in their dusty closets that they don't want to talk about. And
Yeah.
technology due diligence is about trying to discover as much of that stuff as possible and then put a dollar figure on what it's going to cost to fix it. Because then what the bankers will do is they will argue that they should pay $20 million less because of this problem that you
Mm.
haven't told us about,
Yeah.
So yeah,
All
so it does happen and it does make a difference. And in the case of venture capital, if the technology doesn't do what it claims, then chances are you just won't get any money.
right.
The problem is, and it's happened a bunch of times, is some people are very good at faking their way through technology. And I mean, the most famous one possibly is Theranos.
Mm.
Although I think Theranos was thrown under the bus somewhat because it was started and run by a woman, because there's a lot of people that have pulled off that sort of stuff in the past that have
Yeah.
been men and not gotten into that level of trouble. But it's a good example of sort of, in Silicon Valley, you say fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
And that's true to a certain extent, but you can only push that so far before
Mm.
you stop being credible.
It's true.
So, yeah.
Awesome. So technology is no longer just a support function. It's often a major driver of valuation. How much does technology influence enterprise value today?
I mean, it's a huge component. I mean, the military has a notion of force multiplier, like
Mm-hmm.
things that effectively multiply the ability of soldiers to do their work, and technology is like that. It's
Yeah.
the same kind of thing. It's a force multiplier for things that companies are doing. So it enables people to do much more than they used to previously been able to do. I mean, AI is the most blatant example of this, where one person can do the work of maybe 20 people at
Yeah.
some level, sometimes in some cases, right?
Yes.
Not always.
Yeah.
And so, that is the power of technology. It has two things. It's a force multiplier for your ability of your workforce to get things done, but it's also gives you the ability to scale your business in a way that you couldn't do before.
Yeah.
And both of those drive valuation pretty massively. I mean, it's if you can if you can double, triple, quadruple the size of your business in 2-3 years,
Yeah.
then or 6 months, then that is an enormous advantage that it helps you win in the marketplace.
Awesome.
I also think there's another effect of technology which is really important, especially with AI. And I was talking about this with with somebody, who runs a very, very large technology acquisition fund. They have thousands of companies in their portfolio.
Mm.
And that is that technology allows you to address micro niches in a way that you couldn't before. Lowering the cost of producing software and everything else associated with it allows you to have much smaller addressable markets than you would have before. So maybe a minimum addressable market size before was a $100 million market. But now with technology, you could go after a $5 million market, right? Which is enormous because it allows a lot more micro solutions for businesses, especially for smaller businesses, for various areas that otherwise would have never been addressed. So,
Awesome. So how can company improve valuation before going to the market?
well, if you're talking about private equity, it's not, if you're talking about a private equity exit, it's probably not about technology per se. It is more about how well organized you are internally. So how well your processes are documented, whether your financials are all cogent and look normal, whether your training and hiring pipelines are strong, whether your customer acquisition is a repeatable process, these kinds of things. So it's about process, systematization, documentation, and being able to show all of that, right? So that when people like me come in and want to do due diligence, then it's not spaghetti. It's a well sorted list of things to look at and documentation to examine and so on. That's far more important than technology itself. I mean, to a certain extent, technology is an enabler of that.
Yeah.
But really, it's about, and this is, I always tell entrepreneurs that you need to start with the mindset that you're going to exit. And so you need to start at the beginning, being organized, having cogent financials, having documentation and processes and systematizing things as much as you can, as early as possible. Because trying to retrofit that at the end, when you're trying to exit, is a nightmare and impossible. So,
Great. Okay, you specialize in post-close value creation. Why are the first 100 days so important?
I mean, there is kind of a 100-day myth or 90-day myth, depending on how you look at it. I think it sort of depends on the circumstance, but it's really important to try and get a handle on what is actually going on in an organization relatively quickly. I think the other thing too is if you're gonna have disruption, you're better off having disruption early on rather than waiting for a while. I prefer not to be very disruptive, but it also requires a deeper understanding of what's actually going on. And so if you can quickly get a handle on that and then, make sure that the key people are retained and make sure that you're not bleeding out customers because of the changes and so on and so forth, then introducing any changes early on to prevent that from happening, I think is pretty important. I think we had this discussion recently in a private equity firm that I'm involved with, and the managing partner had a heart attack when I put the 90 days in one of our decks, and he said, no, it's more like 2 years, And so I think there's kind of a myth there. Like people are like, 100-day plan. And I'm like, yeah, but realistically, it's going to take you 90 days just to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, never mind, like actually trying to do something. That's probably a couple of years of. And so I think there's a sort of the myth versus the reality. I think you do need to try and understand everything relatively quickly. And hopefully the due diligence work that was done up front will help with that to a certain extent. I'm also involved in trying to do post-deal strategy pre-deal. And that is part of that. Like maybe you can hit the ground running when you come in. But I think the idea really, especially with PE, is to buy businesses that are already good at what they do. You're not buying crap, hopefully. And so there should be much less of that.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most important things, I was talking about this with a fellow operator, is you need to get metrics that are cogent out of the business.
Yeah.
The way this particular organization does is they have standardized P&Ls across all their businesses. I think that's a really good way to do it. So I think that's the first thing that you do is just get a set of standardized metrics out of the business. Low hanging fruit, probably not that hard to do, and then try to understand what's going on.
Awesome.
Yep.
So, that's even leads me to the next question. What should every leadership team focus on immediately after acquisition?
Immediately, you mean the team from the acquirer,
Yes,
or
yes.
the team from
The
the acquirer?
acquirer. The acquirer.
Well, I think they need to understand the metrics that are going to showcase the progress of the business. I guess I would put it. So, looking at a standardized P&L, good way to do it. They're different types of businesses have different metrics in their P&Ls. If you're talking about a software business, a SaaS business, you'll have a recurring revenue metric, for example, a cost of customer acquisition, a cost of goods sold, that sort of thing. And those standard metrics are really important. And I think trying to get that, and if you're a private equity firm that has a portfolio of companies, having the same metrics across every single company in your portfolio is very helpful, because then you can see when people are lagging compared to their peers, if you will. Even if they're different industries and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, businesses are all doing the same thing. They're all transforming resources in some fashion to deliver value. And so it's important to understand what that is. I mean, I think that's the first thing, is the numbers that are coming out of the business. Do they make sense? Do you understand them? Can you use them,
Yeah.
to understand what's going on? And then the second thing is, looking at processes and looking at workflows and
Yeah.
looking at systematization and so on, and seeing if you can improve that. That's a longer term effort. The last thing you want to do is to take away ownership of the business from the people who've been running it.
Yeah.
That's very corrosive. People leave, and that's very bad. But at the same time, helping them make whatever they're doing more efficient, I think is very valuable. So
Awesome. That's very good. AI is now central to almost every investment conversation. How do
mhm.
you distinguish real AI value from AI hack?
That's a good question. I mean, the first baseline I would say is it's unlikely that AI is actually going to change your productivity metrics. People think that it is, but every single study that's come out in the last year has shown that this really isn't the case. There's actually an economic theory called the Solo principle, which has an equation explaining how humans pivot to meet new challenges, and you don't get the productivity gains that you think you might. What you
Mm.
do get is lower cost of goods, for example,
Yeah.
right? Like we were talking about, the television example is a canonical example of that. So you do get that, but you don't get any productivity per worker. I think the other thing too is you got to be really careful, because a company is a bunch of processes and systems to deliver value. And if your systems are inadequate, or they're undocumented, or they're very rough,
Mm.
then trying to throw AI at that is not going to help necessarily. It may make things worse.
Mm.
If all your data is decentralized and sitting in people's spreadsheets and whatever, you're going to have an equally bad problem, because AI feeds off of data. And if you
Yeah.
can't access the data, or the data is crap, or it's in all kinds of different formats, and you need to first fix that before
Mm.
you can extract value out of AI. I
Mm.
think the other thing to keep in mind, and there's a gentleman named Rory Sutherland who used to be the chairman of Ogilvy, which is one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world. He
Mm.
made up this thing called the doorman principle, which I think is very important and it's something very important to understand. It's basically the role of a doorman in a hotel, and how the role of a doorman is much more than just opening the door. And if you're an accountant and you replace a doorman with an automatic door, then you use all the ancillary value that the doorman is providing. And
Mm.
that has a detrimental effect on your business. And the thing about most businesses is that you have well-defined processes and systems, but then there are gaps between those processes and systems that are filled by humans. And the humans are creative, and they'll just figure out a way to make it work. And those gaps are where AI fails completely. And people are wondering why AI doesn't work. Well, it's because humans are good at filling the gaps. That's kind of what they do. And that's been true for a long, long time. And I think, it's really hard because the gaps are undocumented. They're just done on the fly. They're tribal knowledge and
Mm.
so on. And so if you want your business to be AI native, as people like to describe it, then you need to have, normalized data sets that are encompassing the entirety of your business. So all of the data in the business in a way that is accessible to the AI systems. You need to have well-defined transformation processes that are how you work in your business. And you need to make sure that the gaps between those processes are well understood.
Yeah.
But the thing is that most businesses don't have any of that.
Yeah.
Even the best businesses struggle at some level with this stuff, right? And so you can point automate, with AI, you can have certain areas, vendor acquisition, contracts negotiation, that sort of thing. You can have points where AI is very useful and accelerates the process. But there's other places where it's going to completely fall down. And you need to understand where that is. And I think people are just throwing spaghetti at the wall right now. They don't really know what's going to happen. And it's actually dangerous, because the downside of that is the token costs right now are out of control. There are plenty of companies that are paying more in tokens than they are in salaries. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Uber ran out of their IT budget, they ran out of money in their IT budget because they were spending so much money on tokens.
Wow.
And Q2, halfway through the year, they ran out of money, which is ridiculous. And so I heard actually the CFO of Walmart said that their IT budgeting used to be a yearly process, and now it's a monthly process because of this out of control cost. You think about what it takes for a company like Walmart to build a monthly IT budget. That's insane. And that's not sustainable. Like, it's okay to do that in the short term, but you can't sustain that over years and years and years. And so, yeah, we're in a transformational area right now. I don't think, the Silicon Valley and all the propaganda that comes out of it always promises this sort of golden age of tech. And it's been doing this for decades, and it never really materializes like that.
Okay.
And I think that's where we are right now, right? We're kind of like but it's starting to crack. You're seeing the cracks in the last, few weeks. It's starting to fall apart. The story's starting to fall apart. So we'll see.
Awesome. You've helped companies dramatically reduce time to market and improve scalability. What separates scalable platform from fragile ones?
Well, it's process and systems, really. You need to build things that are repeatable. That's the dirty secret, is you need to build a repeatable process. One that you can, as a friend of mine once said, he said, I finally got a repeatable process. Now I can just crank harder, right? And I think that's really the secret. And the problem is that it's not easy to build a repeatable process.
Yeah.
It is very difficult. It takes a lot of experimentation. It takes a lot of focus. And meanwhile, the world around you is changing. So you need to keep adapting to that as well. So between the two, it takes a few years for companies to get to the point where they have a repeatable, scalable process. And that's really the secret, is you just need to focus on that.
Okay, awesome. So what should CEO understand about technology scalability?
Again, it's that repeatable process, but also I think somebody asked me in another conversation about what should CEOs do now to plan for the next 5 years. I think that idea of removing data silos and having a centralized place, or at least a normalized accessibility layer to all the data in your organization, is really important. It's been important for a long time because it's the only way you can get actual reporting. But there's a lot of stuff that's buried inside of people's desktops and in their email inboxes and everything else that are really hard to consume. And it's not that you want to spy on everybody. It's more like there's a lot of really good information in people's inboxes that is very useful for the company as a whole. And certainly if you're trying to implement AI and those kinds of things, the most useful information is likely to be in those, disparate silos of data.
Yeah.
I'll give you a good example of that. A number of years ago, I was hired by a board to figure out why the company was going nowhere. And they thought it might be because the tech didn't work. And I looked at all the tech and everything, and the tech worked great. And there was nothing wrong with that. And then I looked at the CRM system, the sales management system that they had. And it was pretty interesting because they'd gone through a number of salespeople who clearly were very good at what they do because I could see
Yeah.
the interactions there. And then at some point, the CEO had hooked his inbox into the CRM system, and I could see what was going on with the CEO's inbox. And what I realized was that the CEO was killing transactions, and that his actions and his messaging and the way he was interacting with potential clients was actually killing deals, right? So the salespeople were excellent at getting deals to almost to close, and the CEO was screwing up the close effectively. There's no way I would have found that out if I didn't have access to that data. And that's a classical example of having access to data. I think the other thing too is that CEOs in particular need to acknowledge that you can't know everything.
Yes.
And you need to hire people, and this is my philosophy, but I think it should be everybody's philosophy. You need to hire people that are smarter than you. I love hiring people that are smarter than me, and just let them do their jobs. They know better than you. That's why you hired them.
Yes.
Let them do their jobs, and I think that's one of the problems, especially if it's your own company that you started, you have an ego, you don't want to let go. And that's really difficult. And if you don't let go, then nothing good will happen. You can't scale.
Yes.
For one. So, yeah,
Awesome.
you were not scalable. So,
Awesome. Chris, you've advised board and executive team. What should CEO know about technology that many don't?
it's not a magic bullet, and it's not easy, and it costs money. It costs lots of money, and you won't see any returns until some time after you've made the investment. And so this is a difficult one because technology has always been seen as a cost center, and to a certain extent it is, but it also delivers outsized returns over a long period of time. The problem often is that the metrics of success of the technology often get assigned to marketing or sales teams and not to the technology team. And so it looks like the technology team is spending money like crazy, and the marketing team is delivering tons of new leads, but the two are in fact related, and yet the metrics don't really show that. And so I think, people on boards, you don't need to understand the technology, but you need to know that it costs money and the results that it delivers will show up in other areas. And that's important. And it'll take time for the results to show up, and it may take some organizational changes as well to take advantage of the technology, like we talked about with AI. Those spaces in between the processes that nobody understands, like maybe you need to shuffle things around.
Yeah. Awesome. So how do strong executive team align technology with business strategy?
Well, technology is never a thing on its own. It's always like we just talked about, it's always in service of another thing, right? And I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen in tech. It's also really hard to understand what the technology that's going to deliver the best results. Even for the best technologists on the planet, you still don't know. I mean, by and large, technology projects are always over budget and they're always late. And the reason for that is because you're doing something new and people are discovering what works and what doesn't work in the process of doing the thing. I think, it helps to set out clear goals, for the company, bring those goals down to a more granular level, but also explain to the technology team what you are trying to achieve as a business. Right? A lot of times the technology teams get mandates from other groups and they don't really know why they exist. And so if you want everybody pulling in the same direction, you kind of have to tell everybody the same story and let them understand, even if it's more complicated story, like, we're trying to penetrate this new market, and then there's a long strategy behind that. But if you don't tell the technology teams what that is, they can't help identify the ways in which they can help that effort, for example. I'm also a big fan of horizon planning. I think horizon planning is a very powerful tool that people don't really use enough because it allows you to anticipate what's coming as opposed to being reactive to what's happening around you.
Awesome. That's very great. The future is moving faster than ever. What trend will shape the next generation of private equity investment?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I'm not sure. I think there's a couple of things going on, and they're sort of related to AI. I think there's a really big bubble right now that's showing signs of cracking. I think I think at least from the technology side, there's two big dynamics that are going on, which I think is going to change things. The first thing, obviously, is the whole AI trend, but I think the AI trend is going to be reduced down to more of a localized, personalized AI. So not really running on cloud systems and on big data centers like we've been seeing, but more in your local, on your phone, for example. And I think, compute power the trend in compute power is more compute for less dollars, right? Has been for the last 70 years. And I don't think that trend is going away. The other thing we're going to see in tech is the rise of quantum computing. This is something which is just on the horizon. The US government yesterday announced a new effort to push all of the encryption algorithms to be quantum resistant in the next 2 years, which is an indication that they believe that is going to be something big in very shortly, probably in the next 5 years. I think that's going to be a big trend. I think the other big trend, which I think people haven't really been paying attention to it, which is becoming a thing, is this hyperlocal distributed manufacturing, especially around advanced forms of 3D printing. You're seeing this in particular, there's a company in the US called Slate, which is making a new electric pickup truck for about $26,000. And Slate has made all of the mounting points for accessories available as three-dimensional models so people can build accessories on 3D printers, right? And they're building actually a whole library of 3D printable accessories that you can download and print for yourself to attach to your vehicle, which I think is an example of sort of a distributed manufacturing. In the US, we've been talking a lot about reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the US. And I think this is one of the ways that it will happen is because of that particular trend of localized manufacturing.
Awesome. Chris, after participating in 9 successful exits and helping create more than $1.5 billion in enterprise value, what do you believe is the single biggest factor that determines whether a company becomes truly valuable?
It's probably people, honestly. I mean, venture in particular at the early stages invests in people. They don't invest in ideas or tech. Because the question is, the thesis that the team has at an early stage is almost inevitably wrong.
Yeah.
And so the question is, will they be able to pivot to something new? And can they deal with that change? The question is not, is your market big enough or is your idea strong enough? I mean, you need to have those things clearly, but it is, as a team, do you have the skills and the knowledge to pivot to new things? When you get to larger companies, the same is true. You look at the management team and you say, can you grow this thing to the next level? Have you built an organization which, if you get hit by a bus, then it's going to keep going because it's got process and systems, and you've done the work to delegate to other people so that it can survive the loss of a leader. And that's what really matters at the end of the day, because when you're buying a company, in private equity, you're looking for maybe a 5x return in a few years, 5 to 7 years. So you're hoping that the structure of the company has been built to the point where it's going to be able to do that. And that is a reflection of the people that have built the company, right? So it's about the people. Even if those people wind up leaving because they've done well in the exit, have they built a structure which is going to be able to scale and survive, their leaving? And that is down to the team. It is not down to, the fact that the processes and systems exist is because the team did that, right? And you want those people to stick around post-acquisition, clearly, but at the same time, you would expect them to have that. I had a situation once where I was doing due diligence on a fairly large company, $100 million in ARR, and halfway through the transaction, the CFO quit. And you wonder, you think, how does that happen? It says something about the leadership that is, what's wrong with the leadership? I don't know why. I never found out why this happened. But, maybe the person had a personal, a medical issue or something. It's possible. So that is excusable. But at the same time, I wonder, you go down the road of selling your organization, and then the most critical person in that transaction quits halfway through the due diligence process, it just seems like there's something off about the team at that point.
That's very good. So if every CEO preparing for growth, investment, or an eventual exit could focus on one thing tomorrow that would dramatically increase company value, what will it be?
Well, like I've said, I think, cleaning up your documentation, your financials, systematizing all your processes, that kind of thing really helps because that makes due diligence a lot easier. The other thing I think you should do if you're preparing for an exit is you should definitely hire a professional to help you.
Yeah.
Somebody like me, an investment banker, but it needs to be somebody with a depth of experience because I have been in situations before where, trying to do an acquisition and the CEO of the other company has never done this before. And it's abundantly clear in how they interact with potential buyers. And it becomes a real barrier to getting things done. And so you need to do that, buy side, pre-deal prep work, but you need to do it on your end. So you're a seller, you need to hire a sell side, banker or consultant. Bankers are pretty good because the reason why they're good is because when you sell, you're going to be talking to other bankers. It's PE professionals are finance people by and large. And so they all speak the same language and it's useful to have the same kind of person.
Yeah.
And it's expensive. I'm not going to kid you. This is not a cheap exercise, If your law firm that's going to help you through the transaction is going to be $1,500 an hour.
Yeah.
And so you should expect to set aside quite a chunk of money to pay these professionals to help you. But at the end, it's worth it because that will increase your valuation because they're going to point out all the problems in your existing company that need to be solved before you can shop yourself around. Tech is one component. Obviously, that's where somebody like me comes in, but there's a lot of other places where you can have problems.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be like all your contracts are terrible.
Yeah.
Who knows, right? There's a lot of places that are landmines that you really don't want to have show up in due diligence. And the other thing I will say is it's okay to have problems in your organization. No organization is without problems.
Yeah.
The biggest issue is if you don't know about them. Like if you know about them and you have like a document inside of your virtual data room, your VDR, that says, here are all the known issues kind of thing. This is what we know about that's going to have to be solved post-acquisition. Then that's really good because we don't want to find out about those, that you've been hiding them. That's the worst case. Or you don't know about them. That's almost equally bad. And then we find out about them and it's like, what the hell, that looks really bad. So I think, it's not about being perfect. Like nobody's perfect, but it's about trying to solve as much as you can beforehand.
Great. Chris, I can't thank you enough. We really enjoyed our time. I want to thank you for sharing your insight and your experience with us. One of the biggest lessons from this conversation is that technology alone doesn't create value. Technology creates value when it's aligned with strategy, execution, leadership, and measurable business outcome. The company that command premium valuation aren't necessarily those with most advanced technology. They are the ones with technology that buyers trust, technology that scales, technology that tells credible stories. So to everyone listening, I believe you had gotten so much from our conversation today, and Chris has really delivered even beyond what I expected. Well, of course, I'm not surprised. I didn't even ask him all the questions. So to everyone listening, please subscribe to our channel, and I'm going to leave a Chris details information in the description box when we post it to our channel. So feel free to contact Chris. So to everyone listening, until next time, build with intention, lead with clarity, create value that lasts, and remember, the best growth stories are the ones that stand up under scrutiny. This is Talk to Phoebe podcast, and thank you for listening. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for having me.